Today we will tell you an incredible story that literally shook the internet. Imagine an ordinary trip around town. A black teenager at the wheel and his white grandmother in the passenger seat. Nothing unusual, right? But not for the police, who decided that something was wrong here. This case became a real example of bias and racial discrimination. But before we get started, let us know in the comments where you're watching this video from. We're always interested to see how big our audience is. So, let's dive into this story. It all started with an ordinary Saturday morning. 16-year-old Jalen, who had just gotten his driver's license, decided to give his grandmother, Mrs. Nancy, a ride to the store. Like many teenagers, he was excited to spend time behind the wheel, feeling proud of his newfound skills. With only bags of groceries in the back seat of their small car, it was supposed to be an ordinary trip, remembered only for discussing the discounts at the supermarket. But as they drove through a quiet residential area, they were pulled over by a police car. Jalen was sure he hadn't broken any rules. He turned on his turn signal, parked the car, and rolled down the window. The officer approached with a serious expression and immediately started asking questions that seemed strange at first. The first question was directed at Jalen. "Who does this car belong to?" The officer then glanced at his grandmother and asked her, "Are you okay, ma'am?" The officer's words made it clear that he suspected something more than a simple ID stop. His tone made it clear that he didn't trust the fact that the woman and her grandson were in front of him. Mrs. Nancy, holding back her irritation, replied, "That's my grandson. We're just coming back from the store." The officer, however, was not satisfied with the answer. He ordered Jalen to get out of the car and show his identification. Jalen complied calmly, although he was surprised by what was happening. When he handed over his driver's license, the officer suddenly announced that the teenager was a suspect in the carjacking. At this point, the situation escalated. The officer called for backup, and soon several police cars surrounded Jalen and his grandmother's car. Neighbors began looking out of their windows, and what looked like a criminal arrest was happening before their eyes. Jalen was in shock. His grandmother tried to explain that it was a misunderstanding, but no one listened. The police placed Jalen on the hood of the car and began searching it. The officers seemed certain that they were onto something serious. They checked the trunk, looked into every crevice, and then began questioning the grandmother. They asked her if Jalen was really her relative and if he was holding her against her will. It turned out that the police's suspicions were based on a simple preconception: a black teenager behind the wheel, a white woman in the passenger seat. This arrangement seemed wrong to them. But here's what happened next. When the officers checked further, they discovered that the car was registered in Mrs. Nancy's name, and there were no violations. The database the officers consulted confirmed this. And then, finally, the realization of what had happened hit everyone. The entire exercise, the stop, the search, the questioning had been the result of the officers simply not being able to imagine that Jalen could be his grandmother's legitimate driver, simply because their appearances didn't match their stereotypes. What happened next? The police, realizing they had made a mistake, tried to cover up the situation by offering to let them go in peace, but Jalen's grandmother wasn't about to let it go that easily. She demanded an explanation and an apology, and Jalen was devastated. The incident left him not only shocked, but deeply hurt, as he realized how powerful stereotypes and racial discrimination are. This story is just one example of what thousands of people face every day. The question is, how can we, as a society, deal with such instances of injustice? Now let's discuss this. How would you react if you were Jalen or his grandmother? Have you ever encountered a similar situation or witnessed injustice? Write your thoughts in the comments. It really matters. After Mrs. Nancy demanded an explanation, the atmosphere became tense. The police officers visibly hesitated, realizing that the situation had gotten out of hand. One of the senior officers on the scene tried to calm her down, explaining that it was standard procedure, but she was not satisfied with their excuses. Mrs. Nancy was not one to remain silent when her rights were violated. Her voice shook with anger. "You think that a black boy driving his white grandmother's car is a reason for suspicion?" She knew that this was not a matter of standard procedure, but of bias. This was the moment when all her anger, built up over the years, came pouring out. But the story didn't end there. When Mrs. Nancy returned home, she decided that she would fight for justice. She called a lawyer and told him what had happened. At first, Jalen was hesitant about it, because he wanted to forget this nightmare as quickly as possible, but his grandmother convinced him that such situations should not be allowed to happen again and again. The case attracted public attention. Local news outlets picked up the story and it soon began to spread across social media. People were shocked. A simple trip with a grandmother turned into an arrest because of the color of her skin. A few weeks later, when the public pressure became too much, the local police department issued a statement. They acknowledged that the situation was wrong and that officers had acted based on stereotypes. An official apology was issued, but for Jalen and his family, it was only a small step toward justice. During this time, Jalen and Mrs. Nancy's attorneys worked on the case to hold accountable not only the individual officers, but the entire system that allowed this discrimination to happen. They demanded reform and training for police officers to ensure that similar incidents did not happen in the future. Months passed, and the trials began. Jalen and his grandmother sat in the courtroom as their attorney took the stand with evidence. They showed body camera footage, audio recordings that painted a picture of officers acting on biased beliefs. Witness testimony added weight to their case, describing how a situation that could have been resolved in minutes had turned into a shameful display of racial discrimination. Ultimately, the court ruled in favor of Jalen and his family. The police were ordered to pay compensation, and the department began making major changes. Officers were required to undergo mandatory anti-bias training, and the case itself became an example of how similar situations can and should be prevented. But despite the publicity of the case and the victory in court, for Jalen, that day remained a traumatic memory. He realized that the system that was supposed to protect him had turned against him in that moment. However, thanks to his grandmother's support and their fight for the truth, he saw that even in the face of injustice, change can be achieved if you speak up and don't give in. The story of Jalen and Mrs. Nancy reminded many of the importance of fighting for their rights and not turning a blind eye to injustice. Their example became an inspiration to thousands of others who face similar problems every day and showed that change is possible if you are not afraid to act. A few months had passed since the trial, and life had begun to return to normal for Jalen and Mrs. Nancy. They had won the case, the publicity had been brought to them, and it seemed as if justice had been served. But tension was still in the air. Jalen felt like something was unfinished. He found it difficult to go outside and drive without looking over his shoulder or feeling uneasy when he saw police cars. He kept thinking about that fateful day, as if something was nagging at him. One evening, while Jalen and his grandmother were having dinner, there was a knock at the door. It was a plainclothes police officer. At first, fear flashed in Jalen's eyes, but the man standing before him seemed calm and friendly. He introduced himself as Detective Michaels, who worked for the Internal Affairs Department. Michaels came with some unexpected news. Jalen's case was much more complicated than it seemed at first glance. "I've been watching this area for a long time," he began, "and I suspect that what happened to you may not have been just an accident." Jalen and Mrs. Nancy looked at each other, wondering what was going on. The detective said that in the past few years, there had been an increase in cases in their area where police officers intentionally stopped black drivers, especially if they were traveling with passengers of a different race. The suspicions were raised by a strange coincidence. In all cases, the suspects had not committed any crimes, but they were stopped for trumped-up reasons, as if they were deliberately creating a pretext for searches and questioning. "We started an investigation, and your case was the catalyst," Michaels continued. "We discovered that some officers were falsifying reports to justify their actions and then covering their tracks. Your case might have become part of that chain of events if it weren't for your actions and the public outcry. A new fact has come to light. One of the officers involved in Jalen's arrest had been involved in similar incidents before, but had been cleared each time." Michaels said the case now has a whole new dimension. It wasn't just about bias and discrimination. It may have been part of a larger corruption scheme involving multiple officers. Things soon got even stranger. Detective Michaels said that after their arrest, their home was under intense surveillance. The officers involved in their arrest did everything they could to make it seem like it was a mistake, but in reality, They were trying to intimidate the family. Even when Jalen and his grandmother thought it was over, their car was being followed. Michaels warned them that there might be pressure or even threats. After the visit, Grandma and Jalen felt like they were in the middle of a storm again. They knew this time it wasn't just bias, but a targeted campaign. Soon, their fears were confirmed. Someone began calling their home regularly with threats. The voices on the phone implied that they had to stop making a big deal out of it or there would be serious consequences. Jalen's grandmother, a woman of strong character, was not going to back down that easily. She immediately contacted her lawyer and local reporters, determined to do whatever it took to bring new information to light. The story was back in the headlines, and now they were receiving national attention. Michael's investigation deepened. Shocking details emerged. It turned out that a group of officers from their police station were indeed engaged in illegal arrests and data manipulation. They used their positions for personal gain. Some of them were involved in drug trafficking and the sale of stolen property, and often stopped innocent people to plant evidence on them and cover their tracks. The arrest of Jalen and Mrs. Nancy was part of a larger scheme. They had accidentally gotten in the way of this gang of corrupt officers, and if the case hadn't received such a high profile, they would have been written off as another mistake. Thanks to the intervention of Detective Michaels, who wasn't afraid to stand up to his colleagues, the scheme was uncovered. When the story broke, arrests began in droves. Several high-ranking officers were fired, and soon the entire department was being purged. Jalen and his grandmother became national heroes. Their story helped expose the deep roots of corruption and systemic racism in their city. In the end, they not only got justice for themselves, but they also helped hundreds of other people who suffered from these criminal acts. Jalen felt like he had truly made a difference in the world around him. After the arrests and the purge of the police department, life began to change again for Jalen and his grandmother. They were now the face of a national campaign for law enforcement reform. At rallies and in interviews, they told their story, emphasizing the importance of speaking out and fighting for their rights. But despite their victory in court and the exposure of corruption, they knew this was only the beginning of a long journey toward change. One evening, Jalen was sitting in the kitchen with his grandmother when there was another knock on the door. This time, it wasn't a police officer or a journalist. Instead, it was a man in a suit representing a major civil rights organization. He invited Jalen and his grandmother to join a federal lawsuit against police departments across the country to set a precedent for major reform. The organization had been collecting several similar cases involving systemic police corruption and discrimination. They approached Jalen to be the lead plaintiff in a new case that they planned to take nationally, with the goal of creating independent oversight bodies for police across the country. Mrs. Nancy, unaccustomed to such activism, was hesitant at first. She wanted to protect her grandson from further media attention and the dangers that could come with the case. But Jalen had already made up his mind. He felt that their story should not end with just a local victory. He wanted to do something more to prevent other families from going through the same horrors as they did. They accepted the offer, and soon their case became the leading one in a series of trials that rocked the country. National media began to actively cover the story again, but now not only as a case of discrimination, but as a symbol of the fight for justice. Meanwhile, Jalen had suddenly become not only a community activist, but a true leader in the new police reform movement. He organized roundtables, met with government officials, and even spoke in Congress, telling his story and proposing concrete steps to change the system. He managed to attract the attention of senators and congressmen, and soon a bill was introduced to create independent committees to investigate police abuses. But at this time, their lives took a new turn. One of the arrested police officers was a sergeant who was deeply involved in corruption schemes. He still had connections in the criminal world, and soon Jalen and his grandmother began to receive not only threats by phone, but also real dangers. One day, their car, parked near the house, was set on fire. Fortunately, no one was hurt, but the incident served as a serious warning. They immediately contacted the police, but this time the investigation was under the control of a new, reformed department. Detective Michaels, who still supported them, took on the case. He assured them that he would do everything in his power to find the culprits and ensure their safety. Despite the dangers, Jalen was not going to stop. He continued working with civil rights activists on the federal case. The pressure on politicians increased, and soon large demonstrations in support of police reform began across the country. But the most unexpected turn came when they were approached by a powerful organization, the Anti-Corruption Institute. They offered Jalen a scholarship and the opportunity to get a law degree. They weren't just looking for an activist, but someone who could use their knowledge and experience to fight injustice at a systemic level. For Jalen, this was unimaginable. He had never imagined in his life that he would one day stand at such a crossroads of opportunity. But now he had a goal. He wanted to become a lawyer, to fight for those who could not stand up for themselves. A few years passed. Jalen graduated from law school and was now a household name across the country. He had won several high-profile cases involving discrimination and corruption in law enforcement and continued to work actively for reform. His grandmother, who had always supported him, was the proudest of him. The story of Jalen and Mrs. Nancy, which began with an unfair arrest on a deserted road, became a symbol of the fact that even one mistake in the system can lead to great changes if you are not afraid to go all the way and fight for your rights. After Jalen earned his law degree and began actively fighting for reform, his and Mrs. Nancy's lives entered a new phase. Although they had accomplished much, their victories were only the beginning of a more difficult struggle, one that required not only determination but also constant vigilance against the threats posed by the system they were trying to change. One day, while preparing for an important trial, Jalen received an anonymous letter left in his office. The envelope contained photographs of him and his grandmother in their home, along with threatening messages. The letter contained strong hints that their safety might be at risk. The letter was signed only, "To those who have not forgotten." Jalen took the letter to law enforcement, but based on his past experience, he knew he couldn't rely solely on the police. Instead, he brought in a private investigator who specialized in witness protection and solving threats. This detective, Sam Richards, was a seasoned professional with a reputation as the best in his field. He quickly took control of the case, beginning to investigate the origins of the threats and provide security for Jalen and Mrs. Nancy. In looking into the threats, Richards discovered that they may have come from a criminal gang with ties to the officers arrested in previous investigations. The gang may have used its influence to threaten to silence Jalen and his grandmother. Meanwhile, Jalen was preparing for a landmark lawsuit against several police departments. This case had the potential to change the very structure of law enforcement, and Jalen knew that if they won, it would be a landmark moment in civil rights history. The trial attracted the attention of not only the media, but human rights organizations around the world. Behind the scenes, however, pressure was mounting. Jalen and his team began to notice strange occurrences. His lawyers were receiving anonymous threats, documents were disappearing from their offices, and electronic devices were being attacked. Unknown people were trying to undermine the case from within. On the eve of an important meeting, Jalen received another round of threats. This time, they were much more serious. The letter said that if Jalen did not drop the case, his loved ones would be put in danger. In response, Jalen decided to take security measures and prepare for a possible attack. At the same time, Richards discovered that the group behind the threats had roots in the highest echelons of business and politics. It turned out that they were funding illegal operations and were willing to go to extreme measures to maintain their money and power. This discovery complicated the situation, as the group had access to resources and connections that could threaten not only Jalen, but anyone who stood in the way of their plans. On the day of the hearing, Jalen and his team arrived at the courthouse under heavy security. The security was provided not only by the police, but also by private security guards hired by Richards. From the very beginning of the hearing, Jalen felt the tension. The prosecution presented irrefutable evidence of the officer's guilt, but every moment seemed potentially dangerous. As soon as the trial began, the court was surrounded by journalists, protesters, and even support groups. Jalen presented his evidence, showing surveillance footage, reports, and witness statements. He dealt with skilled defense attorneys who tried to misinform the court and delay the trial, but his determination and preparation were unwavering. In the midst of the meeting, as matters were heading toward a critical moment, an unexpected twist occurred. A chance video that Jalen and his team had uncovered during their investigation showed the criminal group meeting with high-profile politicians and influential businessmen, discussing plans for manipulation and intimidation. This video became the key piece of evidence that shed light on the depth of the corruption and its connection to the criminal schemes. The trial became more heated when defense attorneys tried to prove that the video was doctored, but Jalen and his team were able to provide evidence of authenticity, providing independent expert analysis and witnesses who confirmed the veracity of the footage. Despite all the obstacles, victory in court was Jalen's. The court returned a guilty verdict, and several high-profile officials and police officers were found guilty of corruption and human rights violations. This verdict was not only a victory in their particular case, but also a landmark step toward law enforcement reforms across the country. But Jalen knew the fight wasn't over. History had only revealed the tip of the iceberg. Issues of corruption and systemic injustice remained, and work would need to continue to make those changes sustainable. Jalen and Mrs. Nancy, despite their ordeal, felt confident again. Their actions had helped change the system, and their determination had inspired many others to fight for truth and justice. They knew their fight would continue, but now they had more support and resources than ever before. The story became a symbol of the spirit and the need to fight for rights and justice. Jalen and his grandmother believed that despite all the obstacles, every action in their fight brought the world closer to a better future. After their historic court victory, Jalen and Mrs. Nancy felt like they had made a significant step forward, but they knew their work was not done. The court victory was important, but real change would require continued work and persistence. They decided to continue their activism, focusing their efforts at the national level to support reform and fight corruption. They founded a non-profit organization called Justice for All, which became a platform for supporting victims of police brutality and human rights violations. The organization not only provided legal assistance to victims, but also conducted educational programs on human rights and anti-discrimination training for police officers and the public. With each passing month, Justice for All grew in influence. Jalen and Mrs. Nancy actively collaborated with other human rights groups, government agencies, and international organizations. They held conferences and forums discussing best practices for combating police brutality and creating a more equitable justice system. One day, as they were preparing for a major conference on law enforcement reform, Jalen received a message from Detective Michaels. Michaels reported that new information had come to light regarding a criminal group they had previously encountered. It turned out that some of the people who had been arrested and convicted had ties to a global organized crime network. This network was known for its ability to manipulate not only local but also international politics. Jalen and his team began investigating and found out that the group was planning to target their organization in order to destabilize its work and prevent further reforms. They found that some high-profile officials with whom they had previously interacted may have been influenced by this network. As Jalen and Mrs. Nancy continued their work, their organization began to receive threats. These threats became more specific and threatening. At one point, Jalen even began receiving strange messages attempting to bribe him or frame him to discredit his work. One night, when Jalen and Mrs. Nancy returned home after a long day of work, they discovered that their home had been broken into. Nothing was stolen inside, but they found several threatening notes and signs that suggested that someone was watching them. This incident further strengthened their resolve to continue the fight despite the dangers. Together with Detective Michaels, they increased their security. Their home and office were equipped with surveillance cameras and 24-hour security. Jalen and Mrs. Nancy became more cautious in their actions and carefully planned every meeting and public appearance. Meanwhile, on the international stage, Jalen received an invitation to speak at a major human rights conference in Geneva. It was a great opportunity to talk about his work and raise questions about global corruption and bias in law enforcement. He knew it could be a chance to raise awareness, but also a platform for further action. At the conference, Jalen gave a speech that left a strong impression on the audience. He told his story and outlined how systemic corruption and bias can threaten society as a whole. His speech caused a storm of responses and attracted the attention of world leaders and human rights organizations. The conference was followed by a slew of international actions and agreements to support reform and combat corruption in law enforcement. Jalen and his team were invited to collaborate with various human rights organizations around the world and develop new strategies to combat systemic injustice. But suddenly, in the midst of international success, Jalen received shocking news. One of his closest colleagues, who worked with him on important cases, was found dead under mysterious circumstances. This shocked him and his team. It soon became clear that the death of his colleague was related to their cases, and it threatened everything they had achieved. The investigation into the death of a colleague revealed new, darker aspects of the global criminal network. It turned out that their work was on the verge of uncovering covert operations that involved not only local but also international crime. They found themselves playing against major players with not only financial resources but also significant political influence. This presented a new challenge for Jalen and his team. They had to not only continue their work, but also protect themselves and their families from increasingly serious threats. They teamed up with international human rights organizations and intelligence agencies to create a network of protection and investigation that could handle such a massive challenge. Ultimately, despite all the difficulties, Jalen and his team persevered, overcoming each obstacle and uncovering more and more details about the global criminal network. Their efforts helped strengthen international laws and norms against corruption and human rights abuses, and ultimately led to the creation of a new, more effective system of oversight and independent investigation. Jalen and Mrs. Nancy's story became more than just a fight for justice. It became an international battle for human rights and integrity in law enforcement. Their determination and courage inspired countless people around the world, and their legacy became a symbol of the fight for truth and justice. After the tragic death of a close colleague, Jalen and Mrs. Nancy find themselves in the middle of an even more complex and dangerous struggle. The global criminal network they encountered was far more powerful and sinister than they could have ever imagined. This network was not just a group of criminals, but a powerful organization embedded in political and financial structures around the world. Shortly after his colleague's death, Jalen began to notice that his own employees, previously dedicated to the cause, were exhibiting suspicious behavior. Some of them suddenly disappeared. Others began to distance themselves and avoid meetings. Jalen and Mrs. Nancy began to sense that there might be a traitor among their team. This thought was incredibly depressing, especially in the face of constant stress and threats. One evening, as Jalen and Mrs. Nancy were driving home after a long day at work, a black SUV cut them off. When they stopped at a stoplight, several masked men, armed to the teeth, got out of the SUV. They tried to take Jalen and Mrs. Nancy hostage, but thanks to quick thinking and the security guards who followed them, they were able to avoid being kidnapped. The incident left them in shock and made them think again about how deep they had gone in fighting the criminal network. Their security situation became critical. The security guards hired by Detective Michaels were insufficient. Soon Jalen and Mrs. Nancy decided to move to a hidden location while their affairs continued to attract attention. Their new life in a secret hideout was devoid of comfort and security, but Jalen was determined. His work was too important to back down. But at some point, their lives were once again in for a nasty surprise. Jalen received an anonymous call from a man who introduced himself as a former member of the criminal network. The man said that his life was under threat and offered Jalen vital information about how the criminal network worked. In exchange, he demanded protection and a secret place to hide. Jalen was wary, but he knew that the information could be crucial. When Jalen and Detective Michaels met with the informant at a secure location, they heard shocking details. It turned out that the criminal network had its roots in high-profile global financial and political structures. They financed wars, manipulated elections, and created instability for profit. The informant revealed the network's plans to create global chaos that would allow them to further consolidate their power. The information the informant provided was incredibly dangerous. Jalen and Michaels knew they were not only fighting for their lives, but also against forces that could change the course of history. Intelligence about the network's plans was shared with international agencies and human rights organizations, but as the information became public, a full-scale war began. Unknown assassins began to target members of Jalen's team and their organization. They killed several human rights defenders who were involved in the investigation. Jalen and Mrs. Nancy realized that they were in mortal danger and were forced to tighten security measures and seek help from international intelligence agencies. As he fought for justice, Jalen began to notice his own resources dwindling. The criminal network began using its financial might to bribe local authorities and destroy his reputation. Prosecutors who had previously supported his case began changing their testimony, and false charges began appearing in the press. Each new charge and scandal threatened their efforts. And then, at the most critical moment, when it seemed that everything could collapse, another tragic turn occurred. Mrs. Nancy, Jalen's only constant support, suddenly fell ill. Her condition quickly worsened, and doctors discovered that she had a rare and dangerous disease. This came as a shock to Jalen and added an incredible amount of stress to his already difficult life. At that moment, Jalen felt like he was losing everything: his job, his safety, and his family. Mrs. Nancy was not just his grandmother, but his closest and most loyal support. He decided he had to do whatever it took to save her and continue the fight. He went in search of alternative treatments, spent all his energy organizing treatment, and continued to fight the criminal network. Miraculously, the medical intervention worked and Mrs. Nancy began to recover. This battle with the disease strengthened Jalen and gave him renewed determination. He knew that he had to continue the fight despite all the trials. With renewed strength, Jalen, along with his remaining loyal allies and international support, was able to organize a decisive operation against the criminal network. Thanks to a leak from an informant and investigations, they gathered enough evidence to deal a devastating blow. Special operations around the world led to the arrest of key figures and the destruction of many of the network's operations. The defeat of the criminal network was only the beginning. Jalen and Mrs. Nancy continued to work to implement reforms that would help prevent similar incidents in the future. Their organization became a leading force in the fight for human rights and justice on the international stage. The story of Jalen and Mrs. Nancy has left a deep mark on history. Their fight for justice and human rights has become a symbol of courage and determination. They have shown that even in the face of great danger and tragedy, it is possible to continue to fight for a better future, despite all the obstacles. After successfully dismantling a global criminal network and making significant changes to international justice standards, Jalen and Mrs. Nancy felt like they had finally achieved what they wanted. But their work was not done. The world was not perfect, and they knew that change would require constant monitoring and hard work. Jalen returned to work with his organization, which had now expanded to include several international branches. They continued to combat human rights violations, provide support to victims, and monitor the implementation of reforms that had been implemented. But with every success came new challenges. One of these challenges was the increase in cyber attacks on the organization. Criminal elements left behind after the network was taken down tried to undermine the efforts of Jalen and his team. Hackers broke into their servers and tried to steal important documents that could be used against them. This forced the team to adopt more stringent cybersecurity measures and collaborate with leading information security experts. At this time, Jalen received an offer from one of the world's largest human rights organizations to lead a new project to combat modern slavery and human trafficking. This project promised to be one of the most ambitious initiatives he had ever led. The project involved leading human rights groups and government bodies from different countries. Although the offer was tempting, Jalen knew it was a huge responsibility and risk. He discussed it with Mrs. Nancy, who, although pleased with Jalen's progress, was concerned for his safety, but her support and faith in his abilities left no doubt in his determination. The project was a difficult start. Jalen faced many challenges, from complex bureaucratic procedures and corruption schemes in some countries to fighting powerful criminal organizations that profited from human trafficking. The importance of the project attracted the attention of not only human rights groups, but also criminal structures, who began to actively resist and even threaten his life. One day, While conducting an operation to free victims of human trafficking in a southeastern country, Jalen's team encountered unexpected difficulties. Their operation was betrayed and they found themselves trapped, surrounded by armed guards of the criminal network. The situation became critical, and Jalen had to make quick decisions to save the team and the freed victims. Thanks to the quick and decisive response of Jalen and his team, the operation was completed successfully, albeit at great risk. This incident demonstrated how dangerous their work is, but also how important it is in saving lives. These events strengthened Jalen and his team's resolve to continue the fight. Mrs. Nancy, concerned for Jalen's safety, decided to spend time in one of the safe houses they had used in the past. It was a difficult decision, but she knew that her presence in dangerous areas could complicate matters. Jalen and she continued to communicate, and her wise advice and support helped him through difficult times. The anti-trafficking project has been one of Jalen's most successful endeavors. His efforts have freed numerous victims, exposed numerous operations, and brought many perpetrators to justice. This has brought even more attention to the problem of modern slavery and greatly improved international cooperation in this area. But their work brought new challenges. As international pressure on criminal organizations increased, some began looking for ways to retaliate and create new schemes. Jalen and his team found themselves at the center of another major campaign to expose new criminal networks that were trying to take advantage of the situation. In this new phase of the fight, Jalen faced betrayal from within his own organization. One of his key employees turned out to be a double agent working for criminal organizations. This traitor was able to leak important information about Jalen's team's plans and cripple their operations. Jalen was devastated by the betrayal, and it was a major blow to his trust in those around him. However, even in these challenging conditions, Jalen did not back down. He decided to strengthen internal security and establish new verification protocols. With additional support from international partners, they were able to restore their operations and continue to fight new threats. As the years passed, Jalen's work became more influential, and his efforts began to yield results in the form of real change. Despite all the hardships and losses, he and Mrs. Nancy continued to believe in their purpose. They saw their work saving lives and changing society for the better, which gave them the strength to continue. The story of Jalen and Mrs. Nancy became a symbol of the fight for truth, justice, and humanity. Their determination and dedication inspired many people around the world, and they continue to fight for a future where human rights are protected and justice is the foundation of society. Despite Jalen and Mrs. Nancy's efforts, the world was not a safer place. Their fight for truth and justice attracted more attention, and with it came new dangers. One day, as Jalen and his team were preparing to carry out a major operation to expose an international human trafficking ring, a terrible tragedy occurred. The night before the operation, Jalen received an alarming message from one of his agents. It informed him that their organization's headquarters had been attacked. This message caused Jalen to panic. He immediately went to the scene, but it was too late. The building was destroyed, and all evidence indicated that the attack was well planned and targeted. The attack left many employees dead, including several of Jalen's closest associates. One of the dead was a particularly close friend and work partner of Jalen's. His death left a deep wound in Jalen's heart and that of his team. Jalen's team was left in chaos. They had lost important documents and information that was key to their ongoing investigations and operations. The surviving staff were under enormous stress and pressure. The time Jalen and Mrs. Nancy had spent together was now riddled with grief and uncertainty. But the tragedy did not end there. Over the next weeks, Jalen and his team discovered that the attack on the headquarters was only part of a larger plan. The criminal network they were fighting was using the remaining data to manipulate and misinform the public. They began spreading false accusations and dirt on Jalen, his organization, and their work. Investigative journalism began to tarnish Jalen's reputation, and numerous articles appeared in the media with allegations of corruption and misconduct. These false allegations began to affect public trust and put pressure on the funding of their work. Jalen and his team found themselves at the center of a scandal, and they had to fight not only a criminal network, but also a media campaign against them. With the pressure mounting and personal losses taking their toll, Jalen and Mrs. Nancy tried to remain steadfast. They strengthened their defenses and began a thorough investigation into the attack on headquarters, trying to identify those responsible. During their internal investigation, they made a shocking discovery. One of the surviving employees was a traitor. This man worked for a criminal network and was involved in the attack. When the traitor was exposed, Jalen and his team launched an operation to apprehend him. However, during the arrest, the traitor gave away information that the operation was not just run by local criminal groups, but by high-profile international players. It turned out that some of those running the global criminal network were influential figures in politics and business that Jalen had encountered before. With this new knowledge, Jalen began to prepare for a new wave of struggle. He realized that he would now be facing a force that could control entire governments and international organizations. This fight would require even greater determination and strategic thinking. During this period, Jalen and Mrs. Nancy became increasingly isolated. They decided to temporarily hide in order to plan their next steps. In their high-security hideout, they spent months gathering evidence and strategizing against high-profile enemies. Suddenly, in one of his plans, Jalen discovered an unexpected clue. He stumbled upon evidence that linked one of the most powerful politicians to a criminal network. This discovery could be the key to exposing the entire system of corruption and eliminating the threats. Based on this new evidence, Jalen and his team prepared an operation to expose this politician and his connections to the criminal network. This operation was extremely risky and required a high degree of secrecy. They were able to gather enough evidence to hand it over to international justice bodies and support their work. However, as Jalen prepared for the operation, he learned that the criminal network was ready to retaliate. He and Mrs. Nancy were targeted for new threats, and their safety was seriously compromised. The attacks on them became more frequent and violent. Despite these challenges, Jalen and his team continued their work, knowing that the truth had to be revealed. And then, at a critical moment, when the operation was reaching its climax, an unexpected turn occurred. One of Jalen's key allies, who had long been working behind the scenes, turned out to be a traitor working for a criminal network. This traitor attempted to sabotage the operation and destroy evidence. The result was a skirmish in which part of Jalen's team was injured and some important evidence was lost. This situation jeopardized the entire process of exposure. However, despite all this, Jalen managed to gather his last strength and organize a new strategy. He used the remaining evidence and turned to international human rights groups who were ready to support him at this crucial moment. The sting operation was successful and a high-profile politician was arrested and brought to justice. This was a significant achievement, demonstrating that even the most powerful criminals can be brought to justice. However, the victory came at a great cost. Jalen and Mrs. Nancy lost many close friends and associates. Their work left deep marks on their lives, and they realized that no victory could ever fully justify the personal losses and suffering. The story of Jalen and Mrs. Nancy, despite all the challenges, became a symbol of resilience and determination. Their struggle showed that even in the face of the darkest and most difficult problems, it is possible to find the bright side and make a difference. Their lives became an example of how courage and dedication can change the world, despite all the tragedies and unexpected turns of fate. After a major expose of a high-profile politician and his connections to a criminal network, Jalen and Mrs. Nancy are faced with a new reality. Although their actions led to important changes and the arrest of influential criminals, they realized that their work was only the beginning of a long journey to a better world. Immediately after the successful operation, Jalen and Mrs. Nancy returned to their work, but now with a new approach. Their organization was significantly strengthened by international support and cooperation with human rights groups. Inspired by their success, they decided to expand their efforts and focus on systemic reform. However, behind the scenes, an even more sinister threat continued to develop. Despite the arrest of a high-profile politician, the criminal groups did not give up. They began to consolidate their forces and form new alliances to compensate for their losses. To make matters worse, the criminal organizations began to target those involved in the exposure. including Jalen and Mrs. Nancy. At this time, Jalen and his team received information that a criminal network was planning a large-scale operation to undermine political stability in several key countries. This information shocked them, as it showed that the network was trying to create a new crisis to achieve its goals. The operation to prevent this crisis required rapid intervention and international cooperation. Jalen and his team worked around the clock to develop a strategy to disrupt the criminals' plans. They enlisted the help of international intelligence agencies, human rights organizations, and even some former members of the criminal network who agreed to help. But in the midst of this work, another tragic turn occurred. Jalen received news that Mrs. Nancy had disappeared. She had been kidnapped by unknown persons, and her whereabouts were unknown. This was not only a personal tragedy for Jalen, but also a threat to the entire operation. Intelligence agencies and private investigators began an active search, but the kidnappers remained hidden. While Jalen continued his efforts to prevent the crisis, he was consumed with the search for Mrs. Nancy. He knew that her safety was directly tied to their success in combating the criminal network. In this state of deep anxiety and stress, Jalen discovered that the kidnappers had left several clues that, although insignificant, pointed to the possible location of Mrs. Nancy. He and his team began investigating and soon discovered that she was not kidnapped simply for money, but to put pressure on Jalen and disrupt his plans. While Jalen was searching, the task forces were able to thwart some of the criminals' plans, but the situation remained tense. At the last moment, Jalen learned that Mrs. Nancy was in one of the abandoned factories on the outskirts of the city. He immediately organized an operation to rescue her. The operation was difficult and dangerous. Jalen and his team encountered armed guards, and the fighting was intense. They eventually managed to free Mrs. Nancy, but her condition was extremely serious. She was exhausted and injured, but alive. After rescuing Mrs. Nancy, Jalen and his team returned to their work. The kidnapping showed how seriously the criminal network took their efforts and the threat they posed. Despite the trauma and personal loss, Jalen and Mrs. Nancy continued to fight. Recovering from the kidnapping took time, but their resolve remained unwavering. Jalen and his team completed the operation to prevent a political crisis, and their efforts were key to stabilizing the situation. The world community recognized their contribution, and Jalen received international recognition for his work and courage. Despite all the trials and tragedies, Jalen and Mrs. Nancy continued their work, but now with greater awareness of the risks and challenges they faced, they decided to use their experience to train and inspire other advocacy groups, passing on their knowledge and strategies. The story of Jalen and Mrs. Nancy ended on an optimistic note. Their work led to significant changes and improvements in the world, and they became symbols of resilience and courage. Although they experienced many tragedies and trials, their determination and commitment helped them make the world a little better and safer for future generations. After experiencing a series of shocks, Jalen and Mrs. Nancy's life took a new turn. Saving Mrs. Nancy and successfully averting a political crisis were important milestones in their fight, but new challenges appeared on the horizon that required even greater determination and strategy. After recovering from her kidnapping, Mrs. Nancy returned to work with renewed energy and determination. She knew that their fight against the criminal network was far from over. Jalen and his team continued their work, but now with a new focus, they began to prevent future threats and strengthen global cooperation to fight crime. One of the new challenges they faced was investigating new ways to finance criminal organizations. They discovered that criminal networks had begun to use modern technology to disguise their financial flows and circumvent international anti-money laundering laws. This required Jalen and his team to analyze in detail and implement new methods to track financial transactions. Against this backdrop, another unexpected twist occurred. Jalen received a letter from an unknown sender that contained cryptic coordinates and a strange message. The truth is deeper than it seems. Find traces of the past to understand the future. The letter was signed with initials that Jalen had seen before in his investigations. It was related to a mysterious character, rumored to be an old enemy who was once part of a criminal network but disappeared after a major scandal. Jalen and Mrs. Nancy decided to follow the coordinates, and their trail led them to an old warehouse on the outskirts of town that had been abandoned for a long time. Inside the warehouse, they discovered hidden rooms with documents and notes that indicated the existence of even older and more powerful organizations that had been influencing global crime for decades. These documents indicated that the criminal networks they had encountered were just the tip of the iceberg. The materials found included information about secret agreements and corrupt contacts that linked criminals to political and business elites. One document contained a plan to create a new global financial order in which criminal organizations would control the economy on a global scale. Jalen and Mrs. Nancy realized that their job was becoming even more difficult. They decided to conduct their own investigation and uncover the links between these ancient organizations and modern criminal networks. They had to work in strict secrecy to avoid drawing attention to their actions and endangering their allies. Jalen soon encountered an unlikely ally. An old enemy who had once been part of the criminal network reached out and offered to help. The man, named Alexander, was a former high-profile criminal player who, after internal conflict and betrayal within his organization, decided to turn to the light side. Alexander offered his help in exchange for protection and a chance to atone for his sins. Alexander was instrumental in uncovering the secret connections between criminal groups and political figures. He provided Jalen with information about a major financial event that was to become a milestone in the criminals' plans to create a new world order. This event was of critical importance, and Jalen realized that preventing it would mean stopping the criminals' plans for many years to come. Preparing for the operation to prevent the event was complex and risky. Jalen and his team worked around the clock to gather all the necessary evidence and organize the actions. They had to infiltrate a high-profile event where they faced the biggest challenge of their entire careers. The operation was carried out with the utmost discretion. Jalen and his allies were able to identify the key participants of the event and expose their criminal plans. They published the evidence in international media, which led to global condemnation and the financial collapse of the criminals' plans. However, victory once again came at a high cost. During the operation, Jalen and his team faced a new wave of attacks and threats. Criminal organizations, unwilling to accept defeat, began to attack their bases and develop new methods of manipulation and disinformation. In this context, another tragic event occurred. As a result of one of the attacks, Mrs. Nancy was seriously injured. Despite all the efforts of doctors, her condition was critical. Jalen was devastated. He knew that without her, he would not be able to continue the fight, but at the same time, he knew that her health required maximum concentration and care. While Mrs. Nancy was undergoing treatment, Jalen took over the organization and continued to fight the criminal network. He used his connections and information to continue to expose and prevent new threats. During this time, he also actively worked on Mrs. Nancy's recovery and looked for treatments that could save her life. Despite all the difficulties, Jalen found a way to inspire his team and continue their work. He organized a large-scale international conference, where evidence of criminal plans and proposals for combating crime were presented. This conference attracted the attention of the world community and contributed to the creation of new global initiatives to combat crime and corruption. Mrs. Nancy, despite her serious condition, showed incredible fortitude and began to recover. Her support and dedication became an inspiration to Jalen and the entire team. Once her condition stabilized, she returned to work again, albeit with limited strength. Over time, Jalen and Mrs. Nancy were able to achieve new successes in their work. They continued their fight, knowing that their work had a huge impact on the world. Their efforts led to the creation of international agreements aimed at preventing crime and strengthening human rights. The story of Jalen and Mrs. Nancy has become a symbol of resilience, courage, and fortitude. Their personal sacrifices and fight for justice have left a deep mark on history and inspired many people around the world. They have shown that even in the most difficult situations, one can find the strength and determination to continue the fight for a better future. After successfully exposing the network's plans and restoring the organization's operations, Jalen and Mrs. Nancy were hoping for a long-awaited calm. However, their peaceful period was short-lived. Soon after returning to work, they began to notice warning signs that their enemies had become even more sophisticated and dangerous. One day, Jalen received an anonymous threatening message, telling him that their past successes had attracted the attention of far more powerful and secretive groups. These new enemies, known only in narrow circles as the Shadow Confederacy, were known for their ability to manipulate global political and financial systems while remaining in the shadows. In parallel, Mrs. Nancy discovered strange financial transactions that indicated money laundering attempts through a number of international charities. These funds, previously considered reliable partners, now found themselves under suspicion. Together with the team, Jalen and Mrs. Nancy began an investigation that soon led to a shocking discovery. These funds were being used to finance terrorist groups and covert operations aimed at global stability. One rainy evening, while Jalen and his team were working to expose the links between the foundations and terrorist groups, their headquarters was attacked. A group of armed men, who were later revealed to be mercenaries of the Shadow Confederation, hacked the security system and tried to destroy evidence of their work. Jalen and several employees were able to evacuate in time, but most of their documents and technical equipment were destroyed. The attack left Jalen and his team in a position where they had to recover lost data and continue their investigation under increased pressure. Moreover, they began receiving messages from unknown sources indicating possible leaks and plans to attack their allies. Against this backdrop, Mrs. Nancy, despite her recent injury, made the decision to return to active duty to assist in the recovery and investigation. Her determination and experience proved invaluable during this difficult time. She began working on creating a new defense plan and strategy to neutralize threats and protect her allies. In the midst of the crisis, Jalen and Mrs. Nancy received an unexpected offer of help from Alexander, a former enemy who had become a key player in uncovering the Shadow Confederacy's plan. He revealed that he had access to the Confederacy's internal documents and plans, and offered the information in exchange for protection and amnesty. As they delved deeper into the Shadow Confederacy's plans, Jalen and his team began to encounter elements that went beyond the traditional criminal underworld. The Confederacy operated complex networks of influence and had access to sensitive information that could destabilize entire nations. One day, while analyzing data, Jalen came across a shocking piece of information. The Shadow Confederation was planning a massive attack on international financial institutions that would cause economic collapse in several countries at once. This attack, according to their calculations, would lead to global economic instability and strengthen their power on the world stage. To prevent a catastrophe, Jalen and his team devised a complex plan to expose and neutralize this threat. The operation required them to go undercover and create an extensive network of informants. They also established covert ties with international intelligence agencies and human rights organizations to join forces against a common enemy. The night before the planned attacks on the financial institutions, Jalen and his team carried out the final steps of their plan. They organized a coordinated expose effort, sending information to international agencies and ensuring emergency intervention. However, at the most critical moment, when they were ready for the final operation, an unexpected turn occurred. Alexander, who provided key information about the plans of the Shadow Confederation, was charged with treason in collaboration with criminal groups. This charge seemed absurd, since Alexander was one of those who helped to uncover the secret plans, but suspicions against him increased after another attack on their headquarters. Jalen, trying to understand what happened, decided to conduct his own investigation. In the process, he discovered that the accusations against Alexander were part of an elaborate game by the Shadow Confederation, aimed at undermining the trust of their allies and creating internal discord. By exposing the truth about the Shadow Confederation's plans to the world and exposing their dastardly game, Jalen was able to prevent a global catastrophe. However, he and his team had to endure a difficult and grueling process of rebuilding trust and cooperation. Despite all the challenges, Jalen and Mrs. Nancy continued their work. They learned from their mistakes and strengthened their organization, creating more resilient relationships and strategies to combat global threats. Their story became a testament to fortitude, courage, and determination in the face of the most difficult challenges, and they continued to fight for peace and justice, inspiring many with their example. After preventing a major attack by the Shadow Confederacy, Jalen and Mrs. Nancy returned to work, trying to rebuild their organization and strengthen their international ties. They organized large conferences and seminars to share their knowledge and experience, and to help other human rights groups in their fight against global threats. However, during this period of relative calm, they were faced with a new and most dangerous threat yet. Rumors began to circulate about a mysterious Long Night project, which, according to leaked data, was initiated by a group of high-profile businessmen and politicians. This project involved the creation of a new type of social control and governance, using advanced surveillance and manipulation technologies. One evening, while Jalen and Mrs. Nancy were working on their investigation, their office was broken into. This time, the attackers left no trace, indicating highly trained professionals. The attack destroyed most of their data, including key evidence on the Long Night project. The situation looked hopeless, and they realized that the project might be even more dangerous than they thought. Despite this, Jalen and Nancy were not deterred. They decided to go undercover to uncover information about the Long Night project. During their investigation, they discovered that the project was actually part of a plan to create a global network of control and manipulation of public opinion, using a combination of artificial intelligence, social media, and new technologies to create a pseudo-reality. Jalen soon came across an old ally from among those they had previously considered enemies, Edward, a high-profile software developer involved in developing one of the components of the Long Night technology. Edward offered his assistance, revealing that the project had already grown beyond a manageable scale and that it involved some of the most powerful figures in the world. As they dug deeper, Jalen and Mrs. Nancy discovered a shocking truth. One of the lead developers of Long Night was connected to internal traitors within their own organization. This man, whose loyalties were questionable, was using his position to sabotage their efforts and prevent the truth from being revealed. As they tried to uncover the traitor, it led to a new series of events. During one of the operations they relied on to obtain crucial evidence, another tragedy occurred. Mrs. Nancy was kidnapped in the middle of the operation, and her whereabouts remained unknown. This was a blow to Jalen, who now found himself faced with the difficult task of simultaneously unraveling the Long Night's network and rescuing his trusted friend and partner. Meanwhile, Jalen and Edward continued their investigation. They discovered that the Long Night project was in its final stages, and the key elements were hidden servers and devices that allowed for the manipulation of information on a global level. To stop the project, they had to infiltrate its control center and destroy the equipment. The operation to destroy the project was complex and risky. Jalen and his team devised a plan to infiltrate the secret labs where key Long Night technologies were stored. During the operation, they encountered a high level of security and advanced defense technologies. The biggest shock, however, came at the end of the operation. Jalen learned that Mrs. Nancy's kidnapping was only part of a more complex plan. It turned out that her capture was intended to be used as a hostage and forced Jalen to cooperate. A new threat had emerged. She was trapped in a trap containing unique mind control technology that could be used against him and other key figures. In the midst of the rescue operation, Jalen encountered betrayal within his team. One of his closest allies, who had supposedly been helping to find Mrs. Nancy, was recruited to work for the Shadow Confederacy. This traitor attempted to destroy evidence and sabotage the operation, but was exposed and apprehended. After many hours of intense fighting and strategic maneuvering, Jalen was able to free Mrs. Nancy and destroy the key servers of Long Night. They exposed the project and its developers, which attracted the attention of international law enforcement agencies and led to a global campaign to combat such control and manipulation technologies. Although the project was stopped, Jalen and Mrs. Nancy realized that the fight against such powerful global threats was just beginning. They continued their work, but now as international leaders in the fight against new technologies and global manipulation. The story of Jalen and Mrs. Nancy has become legendary in the human rights world. Their courage, determination, and tenacity in the fight against dark forces inspired many to continue the fight for justice and freedom. And although they experienced many tragedies and betrayals, their efforts led to the creation of a safer and more transparent world. Following the destruction of the Long Night Project, Jalen and Mrs. Nancy began to rebuild their strength and resources. Their organization, enriched by new allies and support from international human rights groups, was once again active. Inspired by their recent successes, they decided to create a global coalition to combat similar threats in the future. However, their period of peace was short-lived. Shortly after the destruction of the Long Night Project, Jalen began receiving threats and warnings from anonymous sources that hinted that a new threat was brewing. These messages contained scattered information about groups that were reportedly planning to unite into something called the Eternal Alliance, a secret organization seeking to create a new world order through technological and financial manipulation. Jalen's suspicions were proven correct when they began receiving information about strange and dangerous events happening around the world. Several major financial institutions, government organizations, and even research labs were being targeted for attack and sabotage. New surveillance and control technologies emerged that were a step beyond what had been previously discovered. In an attempt to understand the complex situation, Jalen and Mrs. Nancy organized a secret meeting with representatives of international intelligence agencies and leading security experts. At this meeting, they learned that the Eternal Alliance has its roots in ancient secret societies that have operated in the shadows for centuries, manipulating events to achieve their goals. Discovering that the Eternal Alliance had access to incredible resources and high-tech equipment, Jalen and Nancy began to formulate a plan to neutralize this threat. They began to build a coalition of leading experts, former adversaries, and those who could help in the fight against this new global threat. While preparing an operation to neutralize the Eternal Alliance, they encountered an unexpected turn of events. One of their old allies, a high-profile diplomat, turned out to be a key figure in the Eternal Alliance organization. This man, named Gerald Wolfe, was one of those who used his diplomatic connections to hide the true intentions of the Eternal Alliance and manipulate world politics. Jalen and Nancy learned that Gerald was planning a closed meeting to discuss the next steps to establish global control. They decided to use the meeting to uncover the Eternal Alliance's plans and gather evidence to stop them. The infiltration plan was complex and risky. Jalen and his team used their connections and resources to infiltrate the meeting undercover. They were able to access classified documents and technology plans that confirmed their worst fears. However, during the operation, their cover was blown and they were captured. While in captivity, Jalen and Nancy faced new threats. Gerald Wolfe and other high-profile members of the Eternal Alliance tried to force them to cooperate by threatening the lives of their allies and loved ones. But Jalen and Nancy, despite the threats, showed incredible resilience and courage, keeping their secrets and information. When their situation became critical, their allies took drastic steps to save them. The team, led by Edward, who was on the verge of final redemption, carried out a risky operation to free Jalen and Nancy. The operation was successful, but not without losses. Several of their allies died during the rescue operation, and this left a deep mark on the souls of all involved. After their rescue, Jalen and Nancy returned to their work with a renewed sense of determination. They began a campaign to expose the true aims and methods of the Eternal Alliance, publishing their findings in international media and drawing the world's attention to the danger these forces posed. In the final phase of their struggle, they conducted a series of international operations aimed at dismantling the Eternal Alliance's infrastructure and preventing their global plans. These operations included both sophisticated cyber attacks and direct actions to capture key alliance members. With each successful step, they were closer to completing their mission. In the end, Jalen and Nancy, with the support of the international community and allies, were able to eliminate the leadership of the Eternal Alliance and destroy their plans. This was a major step towards restoring global stability and security. The story of Jalen and Mrs. Nancy ended on a note of triumph and loss. Their fight against global threats and their personal sacrifices left a deep mark on history. They went on to create new structures and mechanisms to combat future threats, remaining symbols of resilience, courage, and unwavering determination. With the Eternal Alliance's plans thwarted, Jalen and Mrs. Nancy found themselves in the spotlight of the world. They became symbols of the fight for freedom and justice, and their story inspired many people around the world. Despite the completion of their final operations, their work was still far from over. The new global reality required changes. Technologies that were once used for manipulation and control now had to be strictly controlled. Jalen and Nancy decided to use their knowledge and experience to help develop international standards and regulations in the field of technology and human rights. They focused on creating new mechanisms to ensure transparency and protect against abuse. In parallel, they worked to rebuild their organization, strengthening its resources and expanding its collaboration with international human rights groups. Their mission became broader. In addition to fighting criminal groups and preventing threats, they began to engage in human rights education and security technology programs to equip a new generation of activists and defenders. One day, when Jalen and Nancy returned to their office after a long day of work, they found a mysterious envelope on their desk. Inside was only one piece of paper with a short message: "What began in the shadows will end in the light. Prepare for the next step." There was no signature. The message left them uneasy. They knew that despite their accomplishments, the shadows of threats still remained. Jalen and Nancy decided to turn to their most trusted allies and organize a new investigation. They discovered that the message came from an old enemy who had been partially involved in shadow operations and had disappeared after the defeat of the Eternal Alliance. This enemy, known as Vincent Laurent, was a renowned manipulator and strategist. Laurent was a secretive player whose motives and goals remained unclear. His return heralded new challenges. Jalen and Nancy began gathering information about his possible plans and connections. They learned that Laurent was preparing something large-scale that could threaten global security and stability. During their investigation, Jalen and Nancy discovered that Laurent was developing technology that could manipulate not only information, but also human consciousness. This technology was at a development level and could have devastating effects, altering perceptions of reality and creating virtual worlds that could be used for disinformation and control. The operation to stop this threat required a new strategy from Jalen and Nancy. They began assembling a team of the best cybersecurity, psychology, and technology experts. In parallel, they conducted public campaigns to inform about the potential danger and draw attention to new threats. Finally, they received information about the location of Laurent's laboratory, where the new technology was being developed. The capture operation was carefully planned and included elements of stealth and rapid response. Jalen and Nancy infiltrated the laboratory, but were faced with new levels of protection and automated security. At the most critical moment of the operation, Jalen and Nancy discovered that Laurent was not only working on mind manipulation technology, but also using it on his closest allies. These people, previously considered trusted, were now under Laurent's control and became his puppets. When Jalen and Nancy reached the main control center, they came face to face with Laurent. He was ready to use his technology to force them to submit to his will. In a tense fight filled with technological traps and psychological pressure, Jalen and Nancy were able to achieve victory. With their help, Laurent was arrested and his plans exposed. Jalen's team destroyed key components of the technology, and Laurent was handed over to international justice. The work to disarm his technology was complex and required global cooperation, but in the end, its use was prevented and potential harm was minimized. After this, Jalen and Nancy focused on long-term initiatives to restore and strengthen international security. They continued their work by creating new educational programs and supporting global efforts on human rights and security. Their organization became a leading force in the field of technological control and ethics, promoting principles of transparency and accountability. Ultimately, Jalen and Nancy achieved a new level of recognition and respect. Their efforts to combat global threats and their impact on international security have made a significant contribution to creating a fairer and safer world. Their story ends on a note of triumph and hope, proving that even in the darkest of times, the light of justice and determination can illuminate the path to a better future. If you like the story and want to continue to follow our new releases, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Your likes and comments are very important to us. as they help us improve the content and create even more exciting stories. We also like to hear your thoughts. What did you like most about this story? Which moments did you find most dramatic or unexpected? What topics would you like to see in our next issues? Leave your comments below and we'll be happy to discuss them with you.